With food allergies, I felt there really wasn't a lot of food allergy awareness, but through the years, there's definitely been, so many more children have been diagnosed, and the awareness has spread. There's lots of different events that go on, walks and lunches and dinners, and so there's definitely a greater sense of awareness, but we still have a lot farther to go. American legislators that I've met with, it's been kind of a mixed bag. We've definitely educated a lot of people who had never heard of food allergies or didn't really understand the life-threatening nature of food allergies. However, because this has become such a prevalent problem in society, a lot of legislators that we've met with and their staff members, at least somebody in the office, has a food allergy or has a child with a food allergy or a friend or a sister with a food allergy. And so because of the prevalence, it's becoming more and more a known entity among the legislators.
Shalom Aleichem, everyone. It's Avi Hoffman here, and welcome to another edition of Shmoozing with Avi Hoffman. And we are featuring today a guest we've had before on a panel discussion, Stacey Saiontz, who is a lawyer whose grandparents survived the Holocaust. Their stories of survival have profoundly influenced her outlook and inspired her commitment to sharing all of the stories and lessons of the Holocaust with future generations. She has served as a founding member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's New York Next Generation Board, and she sits on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Education Committee. She has been heavily involved with the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, and serves as a trustee. She also serves on the board of the Auschwitz Jewish Center Foundation. And in 2014, the Auschwitz Jewish Center honored Stacey and her husband, Mark, at their annual gala. She's also the co-chair of the Town of Newcastle Holocaust and Human Rights Committee. She shares her passion for educating the next generation with her children, who were featured in the HBO documentary, The Number on Great Grandpa's Arm. The HBO documentary details her grandfather's story of survival through a conversation with her son, Elliot, and his great-grandfather. The Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, produced an exhibition in partnership with HBO based on The Number on Great Grandpa's Arm that showcased the film and its animation by artist Jeff Scher. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to have with us, and I'd like to invite her to our screen, Stacey Saiontz. Hello, Stacey. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me here today.
Of course. It's my honor to have you. Now, I showed you that initial clip because as I was doing a little research on you, you didn't mention in your bio all this amazingly important work that you're doing on food allergies and children. And especially because of your own son. So could you tell us before we start just a little bit about that important work? And then we'll get to the things that are so dear to my heart, of course, which is your work in the Holocaust field.
So my son was born with 26 anaphylactic food allergies, in addition to allergies to dogs, pollen, cats, and bunnies. So I've been advocating for laws both at the state level and the federal level that would help make the world safer for any individuals living with food allergies. So in New York State, we have successfully been able to pass a law that stocks epinephrine in every school, and so doesn't need to so if someone goes to school and has an allergic reaction for the first time, the nurse would be allowed to use the epinephrine on them and save their life. We also passed a self-carry law that allows children to carry their medication with them. This is life-saving medication. So if someone was going home to another child's house on the school bus, they would be able to have that medicine with them. We've also passed a law that allows school bus drivers to be educated on how to recognize a child experiencing anaphylaxis and how to save their life using an epinephrine auto-injector. And we are still advocating for so many more. I actually had a virtual Albany Advocacy Day today where we were advocating for a teacher training bill that would train, it would give every teacher in New York State a free 15-minute training on how to recognize a child experiencing anaphylaxis in their classroom and how to administer an epinephrine auto-injector. And there are also some restaurant bills that would provide for information on menus, some training for the restaurant staff. And there's another bill that's out right now that would allow park rangers to be able to possess and administer epinephrine. At the federal level this year, we succeeded finally in getting the FDA, well, the President Biden just signed into law announcing that sesame is now the 9th allergen that needs to be labeled for on all prepackaged food in the United States, which is a huge win because it's been hidden in spices or natural flavors for years. And if you called the company, they would tell you that they can't tell you whether or not sesame is in it because it's proprietary. So now anyone who has a sesame allergy will be able to just look at the food package and know if sesame is included or not. So we've made lots of strides. There's still so many more to go, but I'm very happy with all the progress we've made and the team effort, lots of advocates.
It's extraordinary. How did you discover, I mean, when and how did you discover that there was this issue with your son?
My son, so this was my second child, and I just knew at 4 months old that there was something wrong. He was vomiting all the time. He was scratching, and I just knew there was something wrong. And so food allergies weren't as prevalent. When I was growing up, I really didn't know anyone with food allergies, but sadly, there's now at least two children in every classroom that have food allergies. So I knew a lot of children who my older son was friends with that had food allergies. And so I kind of knew about the symptoms. And so when I was experiencing this with my younger son, I was able to take him to an allergist at 4 months old and diagnose his allergies.
Wow, thankfully. So what I'm fascinated by, were you always an advocate? Did you know what you were doing when you decided you were going to get into legislation? And how did you go about becoming so powerfully effective at advocating for this and creating legislation?
So my background is I was a practicing litigator for 8 years. And when I had my second child, who was born with these 26 anaphylactic food allergies, I decided to stay home. I was lucky enough to be able to stay home to take care of him full time and his older brother. And so at that point, I'm not one of those people that can just sit back and not do anything. And so since I was home, I knew that I could still use my skills that I had learned in law school and in college to be able to advocate for change. And it's funny how I kind of fell into it. I was at a birthday party for my older son when my younger son was just diagnosed. And the child whose birthday it was, his grandfather was a senator in the state legislature. And I was speaking to him and I said to him, I was so nervous, to be able to eventually send my child to school, to public school, because the idea that teachers weren't trained, and these are the people who are spending, these are the adults who are spending, your child's whole entire day with them, really scared me. And as you know, sadly, not every school building in New York State has a full-time nurse. And so he said to me, well, draft up a piece of legislation and set up a meeting with my office and let's see what we can do with it. So I drafted up what's called a teacher training bill that would it would require each teacher to have this free online 15-minute education on how to recognize anaphylaxis and how to administer an epinephrine auto-injector. And it's been 11 years. We've gotten it through the Senate one year and then not through the Assembly, and then through the Assembly the next year, not the Senate. So we actually are hoping it's going to get through this year. But anyways, that was my first introduction to advocacy. And from there, I just was working with so many other advocates because there's so many different areas that need to kind of be fixed in order to protect food allergic children and individuals. So I feel very passionate. I feel lucky that I can, put my skills towards this. So.
Right. And that was actually going to be my next question, is once you head into the world of legislation and advocacy, this is a maze that is very difficult to navigate. How did you figure out? I mean, you started with a state legislator, but how do you go from, state to state to state to federal and finally get, President Biden to sign a bill recognizing anything, let alone this important work.
Well, so the state, there's certain things that have to be regulated by the state. So in the education world, teacher training is something that is state specific. So that we are continuing to work with the state legislature, and that's how we get the school bus drivers and the stock epinephrine. But for labeling laws, we actually did have a sesame bill at the state level, but it's something that really needed to be controlled by the federal government. And it's something that we've been working on since 2014, where we were trying to get the FDA to recognize it. And then eventually we decided to do it legislatively. So we've tried different avenues, and finally this year, it's finally become law. So starting in 2023, all companies will have to label for sesame. And most companies already are labeling for sesame outside of the United States, because Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Canada, so many other countries already require labeling for sesame. So the United States was a little bit behind in this effort. And so we're really excited that the United States is on board.
Wow. That's really, it's quite amazing. The journey that you have to take and the length of time that it takes to get through the bureaucracy is really, God, it's quite stunning. So, is there anything that you could tell other parents? I had two children. I have two children who luckily did not have to deal with any significant allergies. I, on the other hand, as a child, was allergic to penicillin still. And apparently, if someone gives me penicillin, I die. And so this was an issue that my parents had to deal with when I was growing up. Just in case I had to have a little, thing around a little wristband that said, that I had this serious allergy. But that was a long time ago. Now, the world has come a long way. What would you say to other parents who find themselves in a similar situation?
Well, first of all, I'm always happy to talk to anyone. So if someone does have a child with food allergies and they want to talk to someone, feel free to reach out to Avi and he can pass on my contact information. But the thing I do want to say to people is, at first it's very overwhelming, but it gets so much easier and it's manageable. And anyone who has food allergies can live a completely fulfilling, normal life. You just have to take a little bit more precaution. You can't just jump in the car and drive somewhere and not know what your, plan out what your meal is, and make sure that you have safe food for yourself. And you always need to bring your epinephrine auto injectors with you. But otherwise, as long as you take some extra steps to plan and you're not as spontaneous, you can do everything anyone else can do as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I will certainly let everybody know they can reach me at avi@whyIlovejewish.org. And I will certainly pass any messages on to Stacey. Stacey, let's talk a little bit about what I find so incredibly important about your work with Holocaust education. We were introduced by one of our board members, Leah Volinet, who we adore. And she said that you were probably one of the most important people right now dealing from a 3G perspective. And for those of you out there who don't know what I'm talking about, the survivors of the Holocaust, like my parents, are the first generation. They are the generation that experienced it themselves personally. I am a 2G, a second generation, child of Holocaust survivors. But here we now have Stacey, who is a 3G, a third generation. Her grandfather was a survivor, and her kids are now 4Gs. And so, one of the things we did was to create a panel discussion in one of our festivals that kind of gave a sense of what are we going to do when the time arrives, that horrible time arrives, when we no longer have the first generation with us. So with your permission, I'd like to play a short clip of some of your comments during that conversation.
Sure. And I wanted to add a point from your first question too, just because I always think about, when you said what happens when the last survivor is no longer here. And I always think about the quote from Elie Wiesel that when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. And so I, think that, yes, when the survivors are no longer here, the 2Gs, the 3Gs, the 4Gs, it becomes our responsibility, and anyone who has heard, who's had the opportunity to meet and hear a survivor speak, it becomes our responsibility to then share those stories and kind of stand in their place and educate. So that's the first question. I agree with you. Unfortunately, even in states where there are mandates, it depends on the teacher you have. You can have a teacher who, I know even in our school district, and we have 2 middle schools, and depending on the teacher you have, you could learn.
Where are you, Stacey? Where are you?
Chappaqua, New York. You could learn, for a couple of weeks about the Holocaust, or you could just get a sentence. So I think what it is, I'm the co-chair of our town's Holocaust and Human Rights Committee. And I think it's just about engaging the teachers, because the more teachers you can engage, even if it's mandated, if you can engage teachers and get them excited about something, then it's going to happen in the schools. And so what we've done in our town is we have an annual Holocaust essay and art contest. And so, we've reached out to the art teachers. So we just got all of our submissions. And so the graphic art teacher, or the art teacher at the high school, she had her whole class submit. And then, there's so many people who, learn through, they're more creative, right? And so they're writing poems. And then there's those who learn, are really successful at writing essays. And so just trying to reach people where they are, and encouraging different types of teachers. It doesn't just have to be taught in history or in English. If you can engage the art teacher, on the topic. So I think that's it. The important thing is that trying to reach people where they are, and not just think of it as we can only educate people in history.
Right.
Sure.
So, Stacey, tell me a little bit about when you were growing up. When did you understand for the first time what had happened to your grandfather and the significance of it? And then that became part of your life's work, because we'll talk a little bit more afterwards about the work that you do through the Holocaust Museum in Washington and the Living Memorial in New York, and all the other work that you do locally in the Holocaust. But when did you first understand it?
Well, I think I always knew that my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, but I think my understanding grew as I grew. So, I knew my grandfather had a number on his arm. And as I grew, and as I started to learn in school and in Hebrew school about the Holocaust, I started to understand more what that actually meant. And I started to engage my grandfather. And I was constantly asking him questions and writing them down. And then, when phones had video, well, before, when my camera had a little video aspect to it, I would film him answering my questions. And as I got older, my questions became more detailed. And I would always do that. And as when I was 40, I went to Poland, and I went to where he was born and where he lived. And I went to Auschwitz, and I went, to the other places where my grandmother was, and where, the camp that she was in. And so I think, I had an understanding from a very young age that my grandparents were in a war and that they were survivors. But I think as I grew and as I was educated more about what the Holocaust was, my curiosity just perked. And I really, I continued to always, and I still to this day, I'm asking my grandfather questions and still videoing him.
Right. I mean, you're very lucky, because my father, who was also in Auschwitz, refused to talk about it, ever. It took him until my younger brother, who was 12 years younger than me, was at Bronx Science. And he got a project to do an essay on the Holocaust. And he went to my father and he said, look, come on, you got to give me something. And my father finally said, you know what? I would be willing to come and speak to your students. Because somehow he felt uncomfortable talking to us, but it was okay to talk to a group of people that he didn't know. And that was the first time we ever heard my father's testimony. And of course, after that, he gave the testimony to the Shoah Foundation, and he was able to discuss it. But as a child, for me, I always knew about the Holocaust. It was part of our existence, but I never really knew my father's personal story.
That's
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say that's exactly, my father and his siblings knew that their parents were Holocaust survivors. And every Sunday, my father's parents would have what they called the card players. And these were all other Holocaust survivors who would come over all day Sunday, and they'd eat and they'd play cards and they'd reminisce in Yiddish. And that's when all these stories would come out. And so my father and his siblings would hear stories, but they never really wanted to ask my grandparents because they also heard them screaming and having nightmares at night. And so they didn't really want to ask because they didn't want to make them feel bad, but they knew these stories from listening. And my grandfather and my grandmother, I truly believe, when they came to the United States, my father was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany, and they brought him over when he was 3, and then they went on to have 2 more children. But when they came over, they wanted to just start anew. They wanted to give their children the life that they, wish they could have grown up with and not had the Holocaust in the middle of their childhood. And I think they just wanted to give them a happy life. And I think it's a lot easier for my grandfather, because I'm a generation after. And so all the details that I was able to get from my grandfather and his story, out of his stories, I was able to share with my father and his siblings. And it was truly the first time that they were able to hear as many details. And even to this day, he still will answer all my questions. But when my father and his siblings ask him questions, it's a little bit harder, I think, for him to answer them.
Right. Which is fascinating. The fact that you had to, inform your father about his father's experiences is quite an extraordinary story. I'm remembering now during our panel discussion called After the Last Survivor, the Future of Holocaust Awareness and Education. This is something that is shared not only by Holocaust survivors and their descendants, but all victims of trauma. And so, I look forward to the day when you and I can have a more in-depth discussion about the legislation that we need to start writing to, mandate this kind of education, not just from the Holocaust perspective, but from all people's perspective. Now I'm curious because I'm remembering when my children were very young, I wanted them to know, but there was also the issue of age appropriateness. How much can they know? And what can they know when? How did you deal with that with your children?
So just like I was very inquisitive, my older son is also very inquisitive, and he would often listen to me asking my grandfather questions. And I also had a first cousin who sadly passed away a year ago, but she also was a survivor, and she survived with my grandmother. And so I was constantly videoing them and asking them questions. So my boys would watch this, and they would also ask questions from a young age. And they so they were both very exposed, they were exposed to the Holocaust, but the same thing. It was like at the younger age, they knew he was in a war, they knew that something bad happened, but they didn't know the extent of it. And as they started to mature, and, I was able to educate them more on it. But at first it's just, teaching the basic lesson of, you have to accept everyone for who they are. It doesn't matter if they have a different religion, if they look different, if their sexuality is different from yours. Everyone is a human being. And to stand up for other people's rights. And so it's those simple concepts that you educate at a younger age, and then as children get older and they're able to understand more, you can add on and add more detail.
Sure. So that actually is a wonderful, kind of introduction to the concept of the work that you've been doing, the important educational work that you've been doing. And I think it's very important that we expand that conversation, as much as we can. So why don't you tell us when you decided that you wanted, just like you got involved with, with food allergies, and you had a very good reason. When did you decide that you wanted to get active in the world of Holocaust awareness, Holocaust education, and how did you go about joining at such a high level at the museum in Washington and the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, and the work that you do locally in your own town?
So right after I graduated from law school and started, working as an attorney, Holocaust education and remembrance is something that's so important to me. And it's one of my missions in life. So right away, that was the cause that I looked to get involved with. And I had just gotten married, and I had made a donation to the Holocaust Museum, and they in DC, and they had called me and said that they were interested in starting a next generation board in New York City, and would I want to, join as one of the founding members? And I said, absolutely. This is what I'm so passionate about. So I've been doing that for a very long time. It was just our 17th anniversary, so I guess 17 years now. And at the same time, I also, because I just moved to New York City, I wanted to get involved with the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. So at that time, I joined the Young Friends Board, and I became very active in the Young Friends Board. And then eventually I graduated from that and joined the Associates Board. And now I sit on the Board of Trustees. So it's been, I guess, as well, 17 years that I've been involved with that museum. And then at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, my grandfather was a survivor of Auschwitz. And there was this little organization that I had found when I first moved to New York City called the Auschwitz Jewish Center Foundation. And it was a nonprofit that was started by a man named Fred Schwartz, who was a Jew in New York who went to Auschwitz, the camp, to visit, and afterwards wanted to learn more about the town and was horrified to know that there were about 90% of the town of Oceanshem, or Auschwitz, was Jewish before the war, and there were only a handful of Jews remaining afterwards. And he did some research, and he found out that the one remaining synagogue in the town had been used as an ammunition factory during the war, and it was now owned by the Polish government and was a carpet factory. And he, through a lot of negotiations, bought it back from the Polish government and restored it to its original condition. And there was a house that was right next to the synagogue, and that's where the last remaining Jew in the town of Oceanshem was living. And when he passed away, his family donated that house. And so they created what was called the Auschwitz Jewish Foundation, which is it educates people about the town of Oceanshem, because before the war, this town had a lot of Jews and non-Jews, and they all got along. And so his whole philosophy was, you can't understand what was lost in the Holocaust unless you understand what was there before. And so this is this amazing facility in the town of Oceanshem that you can go to before you go to visit the camp of Auschwitz, and it tells all about Jewish life before the war, or you can go after, and it's a place to contemplate. But anyway, so I got the long-winded way of saying I also got involved in this organization. And so all of these organizations have different programs where they educate the next generation, they educate teachers. The Auschwitz Jewish Center actually has a program where they educate cadets from all the different branches of the military, and they bring them to the museum in DC, the museum here in New York, and then they send them to Poland for 10 days at the Auschwitz Jewish Center, where they learn about morals in war, because these cadets are going to be our future officers, and it's so important. So it's just something that I feel is so important. And in my town, I'm lucky enough to be the co-chair of the Holocaust and Human Rights Committee, where we bring programming to our community, and we work in conjunction with a club that I helped co-found at the high school that also helps with bringing really important Holocaust education to the curriculum.
Wow, wow. Bravo. First of all, bravo. Second of all, this brings up what I think is a very important subject that, especially as I read the news today and I see anti-Semitism on the rise, not only here in the United States, especially here in the United States, which I never imagined in my life that I would see, not to this level, but also in Europe and around the world. How do we counter this? And I appreciate everything you're saying. The Holocaust Museum in Washington has 1 million visitors a year, right? Something like that. Obviously, after COVID, they will have them again. The Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York probably has hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. But the bottom line is that there are only, and I forget the exact number, I think 12 or 15 states in the United States of America that mandate any kind of Jewish Holocaust education. And some of them, like Florida, where I live, has a mandated program, but it's been totally defunded. And so there's very little actual education that's happening, even though officially on the books there is a mandate. How can we, and I say we because I'd love to help you in any way I can, and I do it through my work artistically, how can we, bring Holocaust and genocide awareness and education to a larger mandate? How do we legislate a 50-state mandate so that acceptance, which you so brilliantly brought up, the idea that acceptance is what we have to teach, not tolerance necessarily, but how do we accept the other? How do we accept people in spite, no matter what their color, race, religion, gender identification? How do we teach acceptance to children as young as kindergarten and all the way through, college and university level graduate studies?
Well, so I think it's the most important is engaging the teachers, because if the teachers are engaged, they will want to teach about Holocaust education. And Holocaust education covers acceptance, it covers bullying, it covers all of these concepts that are so important. And it also covers how to recognize a future genocide and how to, it teaches about propaganda and different things that we can use to identify if a future genocide is happening. And so I think it's so important to engage teachers, because if you engage teachers, teachers will want to teach about it. And there are so many different organizations that have curriculum. There's Facing History, there's the USC Shoah Foundation, there's Echoes and Reflections. They all have amazing curriculum that teachers are able to use. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. The Holocaust Museum in DC also has curriculum, and the Museum of Jewish Heritage. They all have already created curriculum. And there are so many programs. I know during COVID that both the museum in DC and the museum in New York were able to open up their teacher trainings to so many more. I think, originally they were, 250 or 300 people in person, but they said that during COVID, they were able to have 1,000 people on their seminars for teacher training. And it's so important. And so I think that this new concept of being able to do a lot of this education for teachers virtually, so they don't have to travel to get to a conference, because maybe a teacher in Iowa can't take off 2 days to go to DC and it's too expensive and whatnot. And so I think that because even though COVID has been so awful, there are some positive benefits of COVID. And I do think that the access to these programs and these trainings, people see that virtually they work and they're just as important.
Right. No, I agree wholeheartedly. And I think COVID, which again was a horrible thing, opened up a lot of doors to people around the world. Our organization has been able to reach over 500,000 people with our cultural programming that never would have been possible had we not been forced into the virtual world, which opened up the international borders of culture. But I just want to get back to the idea, and again, I'm very encouraged by what you're saying. To have thousands of teachers from all over the country and the world learning these materials, finding out what the curricula is, and being able to bring it back to their students is extraordinary and wonderful. But I think again, we have a problem. If you have a state that says we don't mandate this, then you are at the mercy of finding those individual teachers who want to teach it. So getting back to the idea of legislation, getting back to the idea of mandated curricula, how can we convince those states that are not yet, mandating it to think of this as a way of, not, why aren't they mandated? I guess I can't understand why there is not a mandate in 50 states yet.
Well, but here's the problem. I don't think a mandate necessarily answers the question, because New York State has a mandate that you have to, teach Holocaust education, but that mandate doesn't mean anything because it doesn't have substance to it that says, that means one teacher could say one sentence that, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, and that fulfills the mandate, right? And another teacher could spend weeks educating about the Holocaust. So just because you have a mandate, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get good, substantial Holocaust education. So I know I'm going back to, yes, I don't think a mandate can hurt, right? Because it's in having a mandate, then schools understand that this is something that they're supposed to be doing, and then they need to, mark off that box, right? And because you now have a mandate, there'll be more tools that are given to each school district. And so I don't think mandates can hurt, but I do think that the bottom line is you need to engage teachers. And I think engaging teachers, not just the social studies teacher, but the English teacher, the art teacher, multidisciplinary ways to engage teachers, and also not just engage the teachers, but engage schools so that they can bring in different programs, for assemblies. I know in our school district, the 7th and 8th graders are hearing from a Holocaust survivor this week, actually. And but there's other programs. I know my son's social studies teacher, I was able to engage her to bring in a program called 13 Driver's License, where this woman's father was a survivor from Germany. And just maybe 5 years ago, in the town, they found in a drawer in one of the town offices these 13 confiscated driver's licenses of different Jews. And so the person in the town office said, what should I do with this? And he gave them to his friend who was a principal at a school. And that principal engaged his class in Germany to try to investigate what happened to these 13 individuals. And through that, they contacted my friend whose father happened to be one of the individuals. And so now they have this whole presentation that this German school and has done on, creating the history of what happened to these individuals. So I just think that we have to come up with creative ways, and it's not always, okay, read a book. It's so many different ways. And I think the more that we can engage people, the better. But I do think that mandates, bring attention to the issue. I just don't think they're the end all be all.
You've just convinced me, because I was all about the mandates, and knowing that even in Florida there is a mandate, but it's defunded. You're right. We have to get to the teachers. We have to get to the students, which brings us to our next video clip, which is, again, a perfect segue to how do we reach people? And so, this is amazing.
This is my great-grandfather. He is a Holocaust survivor. Can you tell me a story about where you're from?
I was born in Poland. Very happy life. They say, well, Hitler's coming to you. That was very nasty. The German came in and they took me away. They put this number.
So I am so taken with the idea that you were able to be a part, or your children were able to be a part of an HBO documentary called The Number on Great Grandpa's Arm. So why don't you tell us a little bit first about how did that even happen? And then I'd love to engage discussion about how we can use the arts and expand the arts element of education and awareness, and talk a little bit about that. But first, how did that happen? How did that amazing film happen?
I happened to be in the right place at the right time. I was at an event at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and they were honoring Diane von Furstenberg, and the MC for the night was Andy Cohen from Bravo. And Andy Cohen actually came up to me and he said, you look like you know what's going on here. Do you happen to know any Holocaust survivors personally? And I said, yes, my grandfather's a Holocaust survivor. And he said, do you have any kids? And I said, yes. He said, oh, you need to meet my friend. So he brings me over to this woman, and she told me her name was Sheila Nevins, and I didn't know who she was. And she said to me, do you have any footage of your grandfather? And I said, yes, because actually I had taken this trip, as I told you, when I turned 40 to Poland to go to where my grandfather lived and to the camps that he was in. And I made it into like a little film for my family, nothing professional, but just so that my family would have his whole story. And so I said, oh yeah, I can send you this little film I made. And I had put all these interviews that I had done with him in it. So it told his whole story. So I sent it to her. Well, I tried to send it to her, but the file was too big. And so I had to ask this teacher, this class, who had taught me how to put all this stuff into a movie format, to send it. And he says, do you realize who you're sending this to? She's the, head of HBO documentary. And so I was horrified because I said, I emailed her immediately. I said, just so you know, this is not professional. But anyways, long story short, she fell in love with my grandfather, and she asked if she could film my grandfather and my son in conversation. And she wanted to film both of my sons, but one of my sons was very young at the time. He was only 7. And so the first day they came, he was very shy and didn't want to participate. So that's why you see his older brother, Elliot, but he is in there a little bit. But anyway, so that's how, and I feel so lucky because they made this beautiful 18-minute movie that is such an easy tool for teachers to use. And I feel so lucky because it enables me to share my family's story with the world to educate next generations.
Right. Wow. It's an amazing film, by the way. And so how did they decide, or who decided, when did they decide to add that artistic, element, that wonderful, artwork and the that cartoon-like quality that is so appealing? How did that happen? And who was the artist?
Okay, so Sheila Nevins and Amy Schatz, who was the producer. Amy is known for creating children's films to educate children about very difficult topics. And so they together decided that they wanted to bring in Jeff Shear. They had worked with Jeff Shear and his wife Bonnie for different other projects that Amy Schatz had produced with Sheila Nevins. And they knew that they wanted to show footage. They wanted it to be a true, accurate portrayal, but these were children, so they wanted to soften it. So Jeff Shear has this technique called rotoscoping, where he takes the actual picture and he traces over it. So it's the actual picture, it's just softer. And for each scene, he has hundreds of pictures for each scene that he has to create. And they just thought that this technique would be able to allow them to have the authenticity and the real actual footage, but in a softer manner that would be easier for children to look at.
Right. No, the animation is extraordinary. Which basically brings me to the next subject and our final discussion, really, which is, so how do we create more programming, more theater, more poetry, more dance, more animation, more films, more ways for individuals? And again, I want to keep emphasizing the idea that, the Jewish population, for the most part, knows. But 60% of the population in the United States of America doesn't even really know anything or believe necessarily that this ever happened. How do we make it relatable to them? Because even, let's say, somebody comes to the school and shows them the film and says, yeah, look, here's this great grandfather. He had a number on his arm and this great grandson, and isn't it great? But they heard at home that the Holocaust never really happened. So yeah, anybody can get a tattoo. How do we cross that bridge?
Well, actually, so, we've been going around showing this movie, and my son has been on Zoom actually with schools all across the country. And we recently had a Zoom with a school in LA that most of the students had never met anyone who was Jewish before. And they had a lot of questions about the Holocaust. And it's just that it's showing the movie, but then having conversation, right? And explaining that, yes, this did happen. And people might tell you it didn't, but now you've seen firsthand and heard firsthand from a survivor that it did happen. And so now you have that responsibility to pass on that knowledge. But how can we engage and get people to actually care about this? So in my town, one of the things that we've done is we've created a contest, an essay and an art contest. And as part of the art contest, we required people to listen to or read someone's testimony. So they could access any of the Shoah Foundation testimonies, or they could read a book on the Holocaust by any survivor, and then to create a piece of work, that related to that. And then there were writing prompts as well. Some people, writing is their thing, but some people learn through art. And so I can't even tell you how many entries we had this year during the pandemic for the art pieces that were created after listening to a survivor's testimony. And they were so powerful. So I think it's just coming up with creative ways that are not always the same, not always saying, okay, you need to read this book, but coming up with different ways to incorporate it.
So I think it's quite brilliant. What if there were a traveling exhibition of artwork created by that could travel around the country to different schools, different museums, and show, all of these, wonderful depictions created by Jews and non-Jews. My big thing right now is that we have to reach the non-Jewish population. Jews are a very tiny 1/4% of the world's population, literally 1/4% of the world's entire population is Jewish. And obviously in the United States and beyond, the number of non-Jews far, far greater. How do we get them? And I think your idea that they can show how they comprehend it. When I was I was producing Holocaust awareness production shows. There's a great production, a great play called Anne Frank and Me, written by Sherry Bennett. Where she basically took a non-Jewish group of kids, right, in a non-Jewish city in somewhere in middle America, who are forced to study Anne Frank. And they're not really very interested, to be honest. And then one of the girls has a car accident, and she goes to the hospital, and when she wakes up, she is in 1942 Paris, France, and she's Jewish. And she still thinks she's in Ohio, but she's really in 1942 Paris, France, and all of her friends are there, and some of them are Jewish and some of them aren't, and they are basically living through the experience of Anne Frank, which they had learned, from the diaries. And she ends up on a train, and sitting next to her is Anne Frank. So, and then she wakes up and she's back in Ohio. The Wizard of Oz meets the Holocaust, basically. I did it for thousands of children in the Broward County school system. They would bus about 700 students into every performance, and we had about a week of performances. maybe 7 performances. And before each performance and after each performance, we had a Q&A. And it was amazing to hear how little the kids knew before. And again, this is Florida, where there's a mandate. And part of the mandate was them coming to see the show. And suddenly that became, the way that they checked off the box. And then afterwards, to hear the shock of learning, because they each had a class plan and they each had to, learn something, and they each had to read something. How do we do more of that?
Well, it's just that. It's all these different ideas, right? It's a show. It's, there's that classroom in California where the teacher told everyone with blue eyes, and they were the capo, and everyone with, brown eyes, that they were the prisoners. It's teachers are so creative, and we have to give them credit. And if we're able to engage teachers in wanting to teach about this, because teaching about the Holocaust is teaching about empathy, it's teaching about tolerance, it's teaching about acceptance, it's teaching about all these different concepts. So if we can engage teachers to want to teach about the Holocaust, there's so many different ways to do it out there, whether it's books, whether it's poetry, whether it's artwork, whether it's shows, there's so many different ways that we can engage the students.
Well, I look forward to working with you much more in the future, to find as many ways as I can help to provide, because I think you're right. If we can create more the number on Great Grandpa's arms, more videos, more programming, more plays, more poetry, more music, more ways to engage the community and the teachers that then give it to their students. I am so grateful, Stacey, that you joined me for a full-length schmooze. You are an extraordinary person who's doing extraordinarily important work. And I'm very, very grateful. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience before we leave you to go back to your work?
No, just thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate being here.
Of course. So, ladies and gentlemen, Stacey Saiontz, who is just, and she is not alone, let me just say, that there are so many people out there right now who see how important this work is and are doing everything that they can to bring it to a much wider audience. So, Stacey, thank you so much. I look forward to speaking to you again, and have, a wonderful summer. And I look forward to being able to work with you in the future and discover ever more ways to bring people this important work. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, we are here, and we will continue to bring you as many programs as we can. And we have so many wonderful shows that are coming up. On May 30th, we are going to present a day of events celebrating the 120th anniversary of the birth of one of the greatest Yiddish poets that ever lived, Itzik Manger. All the programs are free. And on June 22nd, we are going to celebrate the life of one of the greatest Broadway producers. Talk about influencing an entire generation and beyond. The great Joseph Papp, who came up with the concept of free Shakespeare in Central Park and the Public Theater in New York, that gave us and developed shows like Hair and A Chorus Line and The Mystery of Edwin Drood and The Pirates of Penzance. They produced every Shakespearean production in Central Park for free. And he was Jewish. Not everybody knows how Jewish he was. He was born Yossel Papirovsky, a Yiddish-speaking boy in Brooklyn, to immigrant parents. And so we are going to dedicate June 22nd to the memory of, because that was his birthday. He would have been 100 years old. So all day, June 22nd, we're going to have programming. Many of our programs are free. That evening, we'll be doing a gala presentation, which is actually a fundraiser for Why I Love Jewish, followed by a VIP exclusive VIP Zoom reception with many celebrities. And I'm very proud to announce that we have already confirmed the participation of people like Mandy Patinkin and his wife, Catherine Grody, and Rex Smith, and writers like Helen Epstein and Oscar Eustace, the artistic director of the Public Theater, writers like David Henry Huang, who wrote M. Butterfly and many other projects that were developed at the Public Theater. So please go to our website, whyilovejewish.org, and see the many programs that we have to offer. We offer Yiddish classes. On our YouTube channel, we have over 100 programs. Since COVID began, we created over 100 free programs, Holocaust-related programs, concerts, lectures, poetry readings, schmoozing with many different personalities and wonderful people doing incredibly important work. So, ladies and gentlemen, until next week, I am very grateful that you have joined me for Shmoozing with Avi and today's guest, Stacey Saiontz. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.